I welcome Elizabeth Jones from MEP from UKIP, London candidate, for our second meeting at Olay Web TV. We have had the first meeting before the general and local elections, as you recall. This is our second meeting after the elections, which we congratulate you and your party for the success you have shown at the elections, in both MEP elections and local elections. And we wanted to hear from you after the elections. How do you find the results and what the future holds for you for next year's general elections, and on the way probably to elect your first member of parliament here in the UK. If you can give us some ideas, your views and experiences, especially after the elections and successes you have already achieved as a party, we'll be quite happy.
So the European Parliament elections were very successful for UKIP. We got 27.5% of the national vote. We are the first political party to win a national election in place of Labour and Conservatives for over 100 years. That's a tremendous achievement. So we now have 24 MEPs, we have 214 councillors, and we're hoping next year in the general election, which will be the 7th of May 2015, to get our first MPs. We are focusing on Thurrock and Essex. We're also focusing on the West Midlands area of the United Kingdom as yielding our first MPs. I stood for the London region as MEP. Unfortunately, we only returned one MEP candidate. That's the existing MEP, Gerard Batten. However, we did double our vote. We went from 10.5% to about 17%, which is not a huge success, but still is not a backward step. And it's a great pleasure to see that the Lib Dem candidate did not succeed, and Baroness Sarah Ludford was not returned as an MEP in London. So far so good. We're moving forward in a steady manner. It's a very pleasing result for a party that started in 1993, and the sole premise of the party is immediate removal from the EU, so that we will save ourselves having to pay £55 million a day to the EU. We can plough that money back into ourselves. I stood in Lambeth for the Ferndale ward. Lambeth is a very Labour area. However, Lambeth would benefit significantly if the EU monies were ploughed back into the United Kingdom. There are 23,000 people on the housing list in Lambeth. About a quarter of the homes are described as not decent. I think about 50% of the social housing is overcrowded. Clearly, Lambeth does need a significant housing project. This could be funded by the £55 million a day being ploughed back into the United Kingdom and shared out locally. So I can only see it as a positive for people to vote UKIP, so that we can leave the EU and concentrate on funding this country ourselves.
The other point that I wanted to raise is that I remember we talked a lot in our first meeting about immigration.
Yes.
And I kept coming back to immigration. Sure. And I wanted you to explain to us where your party stands when you say immigration. And I also wanted to have clarification: are you talking about the immigrants outside the EU, or you're also calling immigrants within the EU? So it's as a word itself, immigrant obviously covers everybody.
Sure.
And I remember I was trying to get you to specify which immigration you're talking about, or your party is talking about. And it turned out to be a very hot issue during the elections.
Very much so.
For all parties.
Yes.
And I can see the other three main parties are very silent on immigration. They're having arguments within themselves,
yes,
what to say about immigration, or what will their manifestos will be on immigration in the next general election. And what will your party's message be in the next general election as far as the immigration concerned? Will you be arguing mostly on controlled immigration, whereas you're not against immigrants, but as long as it's under control, where it does not affect free immigration, free borders obviously may affect all of us in this country.
Of course.
Whether it's the hospitals, health
schools,
services, schools, housing,
Yes.
and so on and so on. I would like to hear
Of course.
on these matters what your party thinking and what do they intend to say to the electorate.
Of course. What we would be saying to the electorate, we want to leave the EU. We do not want to be part of the EU open borders migration policy. Basically, anyone can come to the United Kingdom, use our services, use NHS services, apply for state benefits. I appreciate that certain countries still don't have an immediate right to claim state benefits, but eventually they will, to claim for housing. So it puts a huge strain, an unnatural strain upon our resources, which are not infinite. Now, what UKIP would want to put in place would be a point system similar to the Australian migration system, whereby it is entirely fair, it is not racist at all, because if you satisfy those points, you will be allowed in, no matter where you're from, which is entirely fair. It's much fairer than the current open borders EU policy, where anyone within the EU can come to the United Kingdom, but people outside the EU can't. For instance, the Turkish-speaking peoples are subject to the ECAA. I understand that they can come here if they have a business visa or business status. They can come here, and after that apply, I believe, is for the Tier 2 system, which again is a point system, such as similar to the Australian system. However, again, that's rather unfair, because it means anyone within the EU, and in 2019 Moldova will be joining the EU, can come freely into the United Kingdom. They may have nothing to bring. They may not be enhancing the United Kingdom's economy or cultural life in any way. However, they can come, whereas people outside the EU who have a lot to give, for instance, business entrepreneurs, artists, would have to go through quite a complex process. This is inherently unfair, and many people do see it as racist, which is a fair comment. So we would say we want the same system for all people, and not to give priority to EU members. And obviously, if we left the EU, we'd be able to put that in place.
I think it's much more clear now than our first meeting. Obviously, this is about immigration, and what's the next topic in the general elections of your party, UKIP?
Well, I think the next stage will be actually the issue, do we as a nation still want to hold on to first past the post? That is, do we now want to embrace proportional representation? Do we now want to embrace a system whereby we can positively and actively remove MPs who we say are not supporting a constituency and not acting in constituents' best interests? At the moment, we don't have this in place at all. So I think that would be the next step for UKIP, to make power fairer, flatten it out, spread it throughout the constituent members. At the moment, we have a very much top-down power structure, and UKIP would be campaigning to push power down and out. A sort of, I know we have localism now, but more localism, so that, for instance, we want to introduce local referendums. So if 5% of the local constituents or members of a ward get together, they can apply and have a referendum about issues concerning planning and services. This isn't available to people at the moment, and I think it is an important part of democracy, so that people may engage in decisions made about their services on a local level. Another interesting aspect, of course, is transport, particularly in London. What are we going to do to ease the transport burden? We would say that one of the reasons why transport has become so difficult, for instance, driving from one end of London to the other, can be quite a stressful situation these days because of the huge numbers of people we now have in London. In Liverpool, in October of last year, the Labour Liverpool Council actually removed all bus lanes, and they're having a 9-month experiment to see if that actually frees up congestion, and does that make better use of road space. And I shall be watching with great interest to see the results of that incredibly radical decision. I think it would be a very, very interesting way forward. I personally am opposed to 24/7 bus lanes. I was the chairwoman of Southwark, and we have in Jamaica Road a 24/7-hour bus lane. Again, it's very frustrating. At certain times of the day, you see streams of traffic stationary and a completely empty bus lane. This is wholly ineffective use of road space, and I would say probably adding significantly to air pollution. So I think we need to examine the current orthodox views of transport that we hold at the moment.
Beginning of our conversation, as you admit yourself, UKIP didn't do so well in London. Specifically, probably there's a lot more population, immigrant population in London, that people think that may be the reason that you have not done so well. And there's some of the statistics showing that white skin areas you have done quite well, which is areas where mostly natives, English people, white skin people living, and obviously because of the economic situation in this country, they may have frustrations about jobs, and therefore they've been more hostile to the immigrants. So what do you offer to immigrant communities in London as immigrant communities that may attract them to support your party?
Well, what we would offer to immigrants, well, I won't call them immigrant, let's call them migrant communities, in London would be self-reliance. What UKIP wants to introduce on a very local level, at ward level and for local authorities, would be for one councillor to be in charge of waste. There's a huge amount of local waste. For instance, there are unnecessary jobs such as climate officer, diversity officer, PR. Someone recently, I think it was the Taxpayers Alliance, recently did a survey as to the cost of bottled water and found out the bottled water during council meetings was a very, very significant expense. Now, why should I, as a taxpayer and council taxpayer, be sustaining councillors' mineral water habit? So we would be supporting a skimming down of local council, cutting the unnecessary fat out of it, reducing council tax, reducing business rates. We would also be committed to freezing council tax. And when we leave the EU, we want to increase the single person's tax rebate from 25% to 50%. It's wholly unfair. We have a lot of old age pensioners or people going through transitional periods with relationships, living on their own. And why should they have to bear the burden of tax, local tax, when in fact they are not a burden on the local system? So that's what UKIP would be doing. Also with a benefit to the local migrant community, as I say, reduced business rates. We're also concerned about transport, as I said earlier, concerned about the bus lanes. We'd want to have an experiment about that as happening in Liverpool. And also parking. Parking is a very, very, very much a hot topic. We think it's unfair that people should have to pay to visit relatives and friends in hospital. Why should you have to pay for hospital parking? Also locally, we think that there's far too many restrictions with regard to parking. There should be about an hour's free parking allowed for people to pop into local shops and support local businesses. That's one way forward. We don't want to sort of loosen up the reins of restriction on local people so that business can flow more easily.
Thanks for coming from my side and explaining us again where your party stands and as far as your thoughts as far as the immigrants are concerned. And as I said at the beginning of my conversation, that we congratulate your party, at least at the local levels, breaking down the three-party system, whereas people have a lot more choice to vote, at least in local government levels as well, and hope you and your party are more successful in the future. Thank you very much.